also worked as a lawyer, a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and also as an advisor to the Australian Prime Minister. He completed his doctorate in international relations at the University of Oxford, and he frequently writes on Australian foreign policy, US foreign policy, and global issues, and has published a number of books. So it gives me great pleasure to ask you to give us your opening remarks. We have maybe 20 or so minutes for that, and then we have ample room or time for discussion afterwards.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for having me. Dr. Samu, other colleagues, Christian, Pippa from the Australian Embassy, very nice to be here. I'm intrigued, I must say, to be in a country where the director of the leading foreign policy institute runs for president. That is my kind of country. I'm hoping that we can learn some lessons from Finland. Yeah. I'm proud today to announce that I too am running for president of Finland.
I will for you.
Yeah, I've seen Sisu on the plane. I've seen the movie on the plane, so now I'm an expert. Now I think I can run for president of Finland.
You will for reports all this practice.
Yeah.
None of that is official.
No, it is very nice to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you at short, as you say, at short notice. I'm delighted to be here in Helsinki. That is not a sentence I have ever uttered before in my life. But it's not coincidental. Unintended but welcome consequences of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine has been the quickening of connections between countries such as Finland and Australia. As you may know, I had the pleasure of hosting Sanna Marin at the Lowy Institute in December, and that was the first time that a Finnish Prime Minister had ever visited Australia. And I am the first executive director of the Lowy Institute to visit Finland. Not that I'm putting those two offices on the same level, but it is interesting. I would say it's interesting. There's a great distance between the 2 points on the map, between Sydney and Helsinki, but I don't think that there's a great difference in the mindsets between Finns and Australians. I think we're all learning the value of solidarity and cooperation in the face of threats from Russia and China, as well as challenges such as climate change. So where is the world up to at the moment? We've come through a pandemic that claimed more than 6 million souls and seized up the machinery of globalization. We're 18 months into the invasion of Ukraine by its neighbour, a nuclear power and a permanent member of the Security Council. Every day the liberal international order seems less liberal, less international, and less orderly. Until quite recently, Australia was at daggers drawn with our largest economic partner and our biggest trading partner, the People's Republic of China. They sanctioned many of our exports, and they have been probing for vulnerabilities in the Southwest Pacific with a view to projecting their influence close to our shores. And all the while, of course, the planet continues to heat up. We see that in heat waves in Europe, in forest fires across North America, and floods in China. It's not all bad news. Ukraine is having a remarkable war. From the president down, Ukrainians are demonstrating remarkable courage. They're absorbing remarkable pain too, and I don't undervalue that for a minute, but their courage strikes me. With Joe Biden in the White House, we have a situation where the most powerful country in the world is now being led by a decent human being, something that couldn't be said during the Trump era. China's international behaviour has moderated in the last year, and the relationship with Australia is stabilising. So there's good news as well, but in general, if I squint my eyes, I would say that geopolitical risk is increasing in the world. Globalisation is slowing. The prospect of more state-on-state conflict is growing. There is a trend towards authoritarianism, and not just in Russia and China. And risk is spreading from the margins of the international economy to the centre of the international economy. These facts are not unfamiliar to you all. Welcome, welcome. But I thought I might tell you about how Australia is thinking about these questions. Ma'am, there are plenty of seats at the table if you'd like to join us, madam. So let me give you a little bit of a history lesson about how Australia has thought about the world, and because it's quite different actually from Finland, very, very different, and then tell you how that framework is being applied by the current government. I would say that over the course of our history, Australia's relationship with the world has had a three-dimensional character. This is the metaphor I want to use. And those three dimensions are height, width, and depth. Height refers to a relationship with a long-distance, like-minded global ally. Now, this is an interesting fact about Australia, because we are a long way away from conventional threats to our security. And of course, we have a continent to ourselves, and we're surrounded by a moat. And so, in many alternative universes, Australia would have pursued an isolationist foreign policy, and in many ways that would make sense. But that has never been the Australian instinct. We have always sought to play a role in the global theatre. Now, we came by it honestly because we learned our strategy at the knee of the leading naval empire of the time, the Brits. And so we didn't just get from the Brits parliamentary democracy and representative government, liberalism and the rule of law, but they brought a worldview where from the beginning, Australia looked at the global security situation. And essentially, ever since then, we have, whenever any of our friends or allies have got into fights, Australia has been there. And we have left our servicemen and women scattered around the world in all sorts of theatres that you would never think have strategic consequences for Australia. So that's the first dimension, height. The second is width. And what I mean by width is engagement with the international system and the multilateral system. Australia has always been full of joiners. We are joining institutions by instinct. And again, maybe this is a point of difference with Finland. If ever there was an institution, we would seek to join it. If there's no institution, we seek to erect it and invent it and build it up. And so whether that's the United Nations, where the Australian Foreign Minister at the time played a pretty significant role, but through to more Asia-Pacific institutions like APEC, which was developed by Australia. This has always been a big part of our intellectual makeup. The third dimension is depth. And by depth, I mean deep relations to our own region, to Asia and the Pacific. Now, Australians for a long time saw Asia primarily as a source of trouble. But I would say from the 1970s onward, we increasingly saw the upside in Asia. We established political relations with the PRC. We thickened our trade ties across the region, and I would say most of the effort and the passion of Australian foreign policy is directed towards Asia and the Pacific, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Island region. So this is the 3D approach that I want you to keep in your mind. Like I say, I'm an historian, if you run that experiment in a different way, you could imagine a country with Australia's strategic geography running a completely different kind of foreign policy. But this is the one we have historically chosen. Now, I might say that the balance between the dimensions, between those three dimensions, has differed over time, and different governments have emphasised the alliance relationship, or they've de-emphasised that, and they've emphasised Asia, for example. But nevertheless, these three dimensions are a bit of a constant. All right, now let me tell you about the current government. We have a newish Labor government. They've been there for about 15 months or so. I hosted Mr. Albanese just before he was elected as Prime Minister. And although Mr. Albanese comes from the socialist left of the Labor Party, he said in that speech that the United States is the global leader of democracies, and he described the alliance as a central pillar of our foreign policy. I am an Americanist myself, and I'm a supporter and advocate of the US alliance. That doesn't mean that we should, and I'm aware as I'm speaking that alliance management, of course, is something that Finland needs to skill up on, I should say. It's not easy being the Americans, in a way. It is the lot of a superpower to always be on the receiving end of both sycophancy and resentment, often at the same time. And often they make it hard for their friends and easy for their critics. And I don't think as an ally of the United States, that means that we need to go along with every decision that the United States makes. For example, I opposed Australia's participation in the Iraq War in 2003. I was a PhD student at Oxford, and I remember publishing an op-ed in the International Herald Tribune. And I have to say, my finger hesitated over send, because all of my mentors in the American system and the Australian system were supporting the war in Iraq. But I felt it was wrong. I thought it was illegal, and it was even worse, stupid, and likely to fail. And therefore Australia shouldn't encourage and shouldn't participate in what would be a blooding for our ally. On the other hand, I think that part of being an ally, being a good ally, is being sympathetic towards your allies, to understanding the dilemma they find themselves in, understanding their interests, and certainly not having the view, anything but my ally, which is sometimes a view on the left in Australia. Always finding something that the Americans are doing that is wrong, and they do things wrong. But the truth is that most of the time they do the right thing. In March, of course, the Australian government announced the pathway to acquire a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines through the AUKUS agreement. And this might be something that Michael wants to discuss further. This is doubling down on the first dimension that I mentioned to you earlier. We've always, as I said, we've always seen ourselves as having global interests, even if we don't have global capabilities. Well, now we're going to have a global capability. Submariners have always said to me that nuclear-powered submarines make more sense for Australia because of the size and the location of the continent, in terms of lethality and speed and range and stealth. But the truth is that these submarines can go much further. They can operate at a very great distance from our continent. They are a deterrent capability. They will pack a very significant deterrent punch. They will help us to deter rash actions by other countries and to help maintain the strategic equilibrium in our region. AUKUS is an ambitious step for Australia. It is a big signal to the world that we intend to play a role in shaping our region. It is also a big lift. It will be a very hard thing to do. These are extraordinarily complicated, expensive, difficult machines to build and to maintain. So this is a big deal for Australia. I think it tells you something about our strategic culture, but also something about the moment that we find ourselves in, that this decision, which was dreamed up by a right-wing Conservative Prime Minister, is being executed by a left-wing Labor government. That will also increase the degree of difficulty. I know that Finland is increasing the percentage of its GDP that it spends on defence as you join NATO. But this will be an enormously expensive endeavour, and that will therefore have implications for other things that this Labor government won't be able to do. So it's going to be a difficult thing. Let me just say a couple of words about Ukraine. You're much closer, obviously, to it than I am. From the Australian point of view, Russia's invasion was unacceptable, illegal, unprovoked, brutal, completely unjustified, violating the prohibition on the use of force set out in the UN Charter. Every country has the right to make its own way in the world. No country should be forced to live in another's shadow. I have been impressed by the way the United States has quarterbacked the response. We know that Europeans, that countries like Finland have been very generous, but we also know that the United States is irreplaceable in this effort, and the intelligence and the material and the money that they provide has been absolutely essential. We are proud as a country to be part of democracy's arsenal by contributing to Ukraine's fight, but we know that it is Ukrainians with their immense moral and physical courage who are serving in democracy's bodyguard. This courage is personified in Zelensky himself, and I had the honor of hosting President Zelensky last year via video link, and it was very interesting for me because people often remark about how smart he is about tailoring his message to particular national audiences or parliaments, and I saw that myself because when I was talking to him online, he suddenly quoted something that Angela Merkel had said to me at the Institute 8 years earlier when she gave the Lowy lecture. And it was quite unexpected. And afterwards I said to my colleagues, did we give that quote, that Merkel quote, to Kyiv? And they said, no. I said to the Ukrainian ambassador, did you give that quote to Kyiv? He said, no, I had no idea that Merkel even spoke at the Institute. So what it means is that someone in Kyiv with missiles raining down upon her or his head has spent 2 hours in a bunker on a computer looking at the Lowy Institute website to try to find the perfect quote to give to the boss for that annoying event that he's doing with the Australian people. And that is a level of professionalism and, frankly, attention to detail that you don't get usually from the most powerful heads of state in the world. You know, usually they're too busy, they sort of dial it in. The sort of flair and innovation to actually assign someone to do this task and to do it properly is the same flair and attention to detail that the Ukrainians have shown, I would say, on the battlefield. So I'd say Australians see the war in Ukraine, the war against Ukraine in a very black and white way. But I have to tell you also that living where we live, we sense the duality of the way that the world has responded. We have, if you like, we have the global East, where China is supporting Russia. We have the global West, where, as I said to you at the beginning, the connections are thickening. Not only Sweden and Finland joining NATO, but the Australian and Japanese prime ministers ending up in Kyiv or Sanna Marin in Sydney, or all these sorts of little things happening. If the global East is consolidating, the global West is consolidating, but then there is the global South, and the global South is basically unconvinced by our reasoning. We often think about India, but the truth is in our part of the world that, with the exception of a few countries, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Japan, and South Korea, as well as Taiwan, the rest of the region is either anti or on the fence. And it's an important point to absorb, because if you live in the Anglosphere or you live in the Eurosphere, you might think that everybody in the world sees this in the way that we do, but they don't. I was in Indonesia a few months ago, and I was struck by how as many Indonesians identified with the Russian case as with the Ukrainian case. Like, I thought as a post-colonial country, Indonesia would identify with Ukraine having been invaded by the former imperial power. But in a way, many Indonesians identify with the Russians because they feel that they've been sort of pulled apart and picked apart by the West over East Timor and various other sorts of issues. You go to Thailand, where the Russians have been very successful in playing on links, weirdly, between the Tsars and the Thai royal family. So that, you know, that there are, it's just important to keep that in our mind, because although it's hard for me to think of a more black and white, more binary situation than this, we have so far not done a good enough job at persuading the rest of the world, which has understandable interests in food security and economic progress, that they should be focused also on this threat to territorial integrity and sovereignty. So, I wanted to dwell on that first dimension, about how Australia at the moment is thinking about that first dimension. On the second dimension, the Labor government is much more inclined that way than the previous Liberal government. The previous Liberal, when I call Liberal, I mean Conservative in Australian terms, but the former government was highly sceptical of the United Nations in a way that I found pointless, basically, because look, is the UN perfect? No. Obviously, you only have to spend 10 seconds listening to the General Assembly or the Security Council to know that it's not. It's silly to genuflect before the UN. I'm not a UN groupie, but equally it's pointless to be a UN basher. It's pointless to obsess about the shortcomings of the United Nations. We need to deal with the world as we find it, which means getting on and using those forums, because if we don't, then China will and Russia will. I mean, it's one of the weirdnesses of Australia that about a dozen years ago, no more, 15 years ago, Australia ran a campaign for a temporary seat on the UN Security Council, and it was the subject of a massive partisan fight. The then Labor government ran that campaign, and the Conservative opposition opposed it. And that was a very disappointing moment, I felt, because it's easy to run a populist campaign because we're spending too much money flying diplomats around and going to parties and all the rest of it. But everybody in this room knows that the amount of money that a country spends on a diplomatic campaign, call it $20 or $30 million, well, maybe that buys you one wing, one tail fin on a fighter jet. It is absolutely money well spent to be seated for 2 years on the premier crisis management forum in the world. As we found out, of course, when the airliner was shot out of the sky with many Australians on board, and luckily Australia was sitting on the UN Security Council at that time because the campaign had been successful, and we were able to make our case in our own name on behalf of our own dead. We didn't have to go cap in hand to the Brits or the Americans or the French and ask them to do it. So I'm pleased to see that this government is much more focused on the United Nations, much more focused on climate change issues, bidding to host the Conference of the Parties in 2024 along with the Pacific Islands. Finally, let me focus a little bit on the third dimension, that is relations with Asia and the Pacific. Let me start with China. Australia now has a different relationship with China from the relationship we had previously. We have a different relationship with China because we're dealing with a different China. Its foreign policies have hardened, its willingness to accept criticism has shriveled. Xi Jinping has been president of the People's Republic for almost exactly the period of time that I've been executive director of the Lowy Institute, and the similarities end there, I promise you. But as a result, I have watched him very closely, and we've published lots of papers on him. And for those people who who argue that international relations is caused by vast impersonal forces and individuals don't play any role. That's not right, because Chinese strategy changed in 2012 when Xi Jinping became the president, changed very substantially, very clearly. Let me explain to you briefly the sort of ructions that have gone on in Australia-China relations over the past few years. The Australian government took a number of decisions to protect Australian sovereignty, including banning Huawei from participating in our 5G rollout and introducing new foreign interference laws. The former government also called for an international inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus. Beijing hated all of these decisions, and in response, they put Australia in the diplomatic deep freeze for several years. Our embassy was ostracised. There were no contacts between ministers or senior officials. And China subjected Australia to a campaign of economic intimidation, erecting informal trade barriers and blockages against Australian goods such as wine, barley, coal, cotton, seafood, and many others. I didn't agree with all of the former government's policies in relation to China, and in particular, I thought the call for an independent inquiry, while it might have been right, was not smart. But most of those decisions I did agree with, and in any case, they were sovereign decisions of Australia. And for China to react in this disproportionate way, to seek to punish us, to make an example of Australia, was truly outrageous. Where I did respect the former government was that they didn't apologise, and they didn't kowtow, and they didn't buckle under the pressure. And I think that was important, because Mikhail is more of a China expert than I am, but my observation after dealing with Chinese interlocutors for nearly 20 years has been that the Chinese respect strength. They don't respect weakness, because China was weak for a long time and it hated being weak. And so the most important thing when dealing with China, and perhaps with Russia as well, is to be clear and consistent, to be strong, to draw your lines wherever they may be and to stick to those lines. Because the second you start rubbing those lines out and redrawing them under pressure, you're finished. Under the new Australian government, the relationship has stabilised. Basically, it suited both sides for a stabilisation. It also suited China, because one of the intriguing elements of the last few years was that because of the high price of commodities, especially the very high price of iron ore, and because of China's addiction to Australian exports, they were actually paying us more money in terms of buying our exports during this period than beforehand. While there was a very great effect on some industries, and some firms in particular were devastated, at a macroeconomic level, Australia suffered no pain as a result of this campaign of economic intimidation. So both sides decided to stabilise the relationship, and contacts have resumed. Albanese, the Prime Minister, will probably go to China later this year, and that's to the good. It's important that on speaking terms. We should be on speaking terms with China. I'm not one of the ideologues that says we should not be talking to them, and that's insane. All the Quad partners are talking to China. You have to talk to China. But I don't think there is a prospect of resetting the relationship, which is something that people often say, because the factory settings have changed. And with the factory settings, so has public opinion changed. So to give you one fact, 4 years ago, more than half of Australians trusted China to act responsibly in the world. This year, 15% of Australians trust China. So I think, to conclude on China, I think the Australian government needs to be firm, circumspect and disciplined. We should cooperate with China where we can, disagree where we must, but always stand our ground. The last thing I want to say is, it's important though not to shrink Asia to the dimensions of China. This is something that often happens in the Australian debate because we're so fixated on China. And of course, this is in China's interest too. They love it if Australia is constantly obsessing about China. The better approach is the opposite approach, to say that we need to redouble our efforts, not only with our Quad partners, with Japan and with India, but with Southeast Asia, especially the big countries in Southeast Asia that have the ability to help to shape the environment, Indonesia, Vietnam, and others, South Korea as well. And then, of course, there is the great arc of Pacific Island nations reaching from Papua New Guinea to Kiribati. This is changing Australian foreign policy very significantly, because Australia's strategic outlook had always been essentially benign. I said we were surrounded by a moat, but we were also surrounded by this arc of friendly countries. Now, obviously, China is seeking to ratchet up its relationship with those countries. We have to respond to that. We have to persuade those countries with whom we have traditional and very friendly links that culturally and politically are much more like Australia than they are like China. We need to respond to those offers. We need to make better offers than China does. But the important thing there is we can't be transactional, because if we treat the Pacific in a transactional way, then sometimes we will be on the wrong side of the transaction. I'm going to finish now, Mikhail, and tell you that something that was often said about Australia was that we suffer from the tyranny of distance. This was a famous book written about Australian history. The tyranny of distance, being located a long way away from our sources of security and prosperity. Well, I think that tyranny is over, because as wealth and power have shifted eastwards towards us, we now face a different predicament, and that is the predicament of proximity, where we are proximate to bigger deal flows, we are proximate to richer countries, but also proximate to potential crises in the future. The only approach that I think equips us for this is the three-dimensional approach that I started with, but focusing on all three dimensions, doubling down on our relationship with the United States, remembering our important connections into the international system, but also really applying ourselves, knowing as much as we can about the region around us, doing as much as we can with Asia and the Pacific. If I can finish on a positive note, it's hard to look at the bloodbath in Ukraine and take any positive lessons from it. The one thing I would say is this, that 18 months ago, Putin still had the sort of grudging respect, I would say, of strategists around the world. The people said, we don't like him, he's mafia, but he's smart, you know, he knows how to get the mail through, and I think all of that is lost now. He's not just malevolent, though he is malevolent, but this misbegotten decision has not only been disastrous for Ukraine, it's been disastrous for Russia. And I think it has shown us the frailties of the authoritarian systems of government. And it's shown us actually, in comparison, the strengths of our own system, the response, the solidarity of Western countries, but also the system of democracy that when you're up close, it seems so imperfect and fragile and difficult and complicated and full of unattractive personalities. But it's better than the alternative, and it's strong, and there is an essential resilience to our system. It is harder, I believe, for democracies to make grand mistakes of the kind that Russia just made. Not impossible, as Iraq showed, but harder for us to make these devastating mistakes, and easier in democracies to course correct because of the pressures of domestic politics. Whereas in an authoritarian system, it's easier for the great man to make these dreadful mistakes and then impossible to course correct without regime change, which has to be avoided at all costs. So I think that is the positive that I'm taking from the last 18 months. Russia has to lose this war, Ukraine has to win this war, but all of us also have to take that strength and draw that conclusion from it, that we should have a quiet pride and a quiet sense of confidence about our own system. We need to believe in our system, and certainly in the Australian approach, we need to invest in all those three dimensions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.
Gosh, now I feel like a baron at the head of this table.
It's, I don't know if this is
This is a sort of Putinesque
right.
table. You should be down the other end of the car.
Do we need a microphone? Can you hear us?
It's maybe better to have the microphone.
It's better,
yeah.
Okay, I'll speak the microphone. So thank you very much. A lot of food for thought here, and in brief, just over 20 minutes, you managed to tell us quite a lot about Australia and many other things as well. I want to start with a quite broad question. You said in your talk, or you built it around this three-dimensional foreign policy of height, width, and depth. And then kind of shifted our time, and you mentioned at some point that Australia, one of these respects, was a bit different from Finland. However, it didn't actually seem altogether different to me. I mean, if you look at certainly the width and the depth dimensions, they actually sounded quite similar or familiar to Finns. What we lacked, of course, in the past was that huge moat that you have, and that key security alliance that the United States has provided. Now you mentioned, I thought it was fascinating, interesting. You mentioned that in any other scenario, Australia would have followed an isolationist policy, foreign policy. You're a historian by training, so let me ask you a pretty tough counterfactual question. Had the close U.S. security alliance not been there, how do you think long-term Australian foreign policy would have looked like? I didn't warn you about this, so it's a tough question.
Well, I think what Australia has, Australia did actually confront that dilemma as the British Empire declined in international influence. Right. And after the fall of Singapore, Australia realised that we could no longer find our security support in being part of the British Empire. And so John Curtin wrote an article in the Melbourne Herald in 1941 where he said something like, "We look to America," and you can sort of date the informal alliance with the United States from about 1941, although the formal alliance happened later in 1948. So you asked, what would we have done without the United States? But what I've said is, we've actually had this height dimension with two separate international powers. So I think to answer your counterfactual, it would depend on if there were a global liberal leader with whom our values were more or less constant, and I think Australians would have been inclined to form an alliance with that country. Let me say that these things are always being litigated, and actually one of my colleagues at the Lowy Institute has just published a book which is almost a call for an isolationist defence policy. One of the strengths of the Lowy Institute is that there is no house view. We often say we're the host of many opinions, but the advocate of none. So I'm delighted that Sam Roggeveen has published this book, but I disagree with it completely. And I think that Sam argues, even now, he argues for an emphasis on the value of distance, and therefore making it harder, or he calls it the echidna doctrine. So an echidna is an Australian marsupial that's like a hedgehog and it has lots of spines, and he says that's how Australia should defend itself. But my reaction as an historian is that that is completely counter to 200 years of our strategic culture. And I don't think it would ever fly. I don't think it would fly for the reason, the opinion polls that I quoted to you. It's not how Australians think about the world. So to come back to your question, I think Australians are always reluctant to define our security interests narrowly. We're always inclined to define them broadly, to think about the global balance of power and to see about how we can, and to try to contribute to that in some way. And can I say, 18 months after the invasion of a democracy like Ukraine, I think the value of having that kind of alliance, that kind of insurance policy is clearer to me than ever.
I'm happy to hear that you also don't have a house view, because we have the same here. We don't have a house view, which gives us very lively discussions and many viewpoints. On another note, you ended up with discussing the relationship with China, not being a China expert, but you still said quite a lot about it. And as you probably may know, since you hosted our former Prime Minister, we have had also a discussion about these dependencies, actually a very active discussion in Finland about dependencies, of course, very much in the context of the Russian war and aggression. It sort of brought up this question also, Finland, are we too dependent on China? We've studied that here as well, just come out to report on that. But it's on a whole different level if you look at Australia. I mean, for us, it's what we import 9% from China, we export 4 or 5% to China. Australia, at its height, was like 40% of exports going to China, 30% going to of imports coming from China. So the question that we have been here pondering, and I think Australians have as well, is how do you preserve a relatively liberal economy and yet shield yourself from kind of risky and one-sided dependencies? And you're kind of ahead of the curve from us. It's a much more acute question for Australia than for Finland. So what is the state of play, the discussion in Australia today about these issues?
Ahead of the curve in a bad way. Look, it's very, very hard because of the complementarity of the Australian and Chinese economies, and pretty much everything that we dig up out of the ground, the Chinese want to buy from us. I mean, the government and national security officials are always encouraging private enterprise to diversify, and I think there's been some progress on diversification, but it's very hard because China is such an enormous market. It's hard to find other markets where a lot of these commodities can be sold. There's been some success, but what I would say to you is that the dependencies are two-way as well. I mean, China is also dependent on our commodities, and especially in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine, then some of the commodities that we export are even more important to China. And the example, the sort of the history that I laid out to you showed that if that China's ability to turn that economic relationship into a whip is not as clear cut as you would think. That if you stand up and you stand up for yourself, then there can be a limit to the amount of pain that the Chinese government is willing to impose on its own economy. I think that is different from the kind of more the more security sensitive elements, like I mentioned, not letting the Chinese get their fingers into our 5G network. I think there are things that you need to ring fence, and I know Washington is seeking to do that. But at a broad level, I think we should diversify. I'd like to see that percentage come down. It's hard. When I talk to officials in Canberra, they think it's easy. When I talk to CEOs, they tell me how hard it is. But the cause for optimism is that China was unable to use that to its advantage.
I'm very happy you said that.
Because I've actually been very much talking the same thing also. I mean, China's coercive economic power is talked about very much, but it's not working very well actually. There are very few examples where it has worked to China's advantage in a massive way, apart from sort of cutting all imports from a certain country like with Lithuania. But it's actually the other kinds of influence that are more interesting, than where China wields more influence. But we have now sort of gotten this idea that interdependence is not what we thought it was, that it's not just a positive force, it brings us risks. But the problem is not necessarily the interdependence, it's the one-sided, the lopsided dependence. So as long as China is very dependent still on getting what it needs from the Australian economy, there are limits to what it can do. But if you're entirely dependent on China, then it's a different story. That's a problem. You also mentioned in the talk, or you talk quite a lot actually about Ukraine as well, and we know that Europe is becoming, or Europeans are becoming more interested in what is going on in the Indo-Pacific. We see that especially with the question of Taiwan, and a lot of East Asians are actually becoming more involved, as you know, also in European affairs. And to my understanding, Australia has actually been one of the most active here in sort of wishing to see deeper involvement of Europeans in Indo-Pacific security. Could you please explain to us the rationale behind it? Why is Australia hoping to see maybe more European involvement in Indo-Pacific security?
Well, I said before that we shouldn't shrink Asia to the dimensions of China, and I guess our thinking there is that that the more players there are in the Indo-Pacific, the harder it is for the one resident superpower to dominate. If everybody else minds their own knitting, then China will run the board. China will dictate terms. On the other hand, if India and Japan and South Korea and Vietnam and Australia and other Indo-Pacific countries are stepping up, investing in their own foreign policy, diplomatic, defense capabilities, exercising with each other, thickening the connections with each other, then it's much harder for China to dominate. Now, along the same lines, we need extra regional players, and the more extra regional players there are active in the Indo-Pacific, the better. So therefore, having the Brits or the French or the Germans or other European powers sending naval vessels or sending other assets and exercising with us and being involved and being interested. I hosted Anna-Lena Baerbock at the Institute last week, for example, on that subject, the better. But I don't think we kid ourselves that European countries are going to make the difference in the Indo-Pacific. I don't think that's realistic because you have a lot of things going on in your part of the world. I think the most important extra-regional power is the United States. That's the most important. Almost every Asian country would prefer the United States to remain deeply involved in the region, even if they won't say it publicly. Even if publicly they will criticize the United States, the bottom line is they don't want the United States to withdraw, because the US is the best provides the best prospect for balancing Chinese influence. We can do what we can do. Other countries can play an important role, but that unique combination of in the United States, the most powerful country in the world, the only country with a global foreign policy, the only country with the ability to project power anywhere on earth, but at the same time not a resident power, not up in people's faces, projecting power from a long way away. That's a much more appealing vibe, really, for most of Asia, and to have that next along with an active, important China, that is the best prospect for an equilibrium. So I've sort of answered it in a roundabout way because I don't want to I don't want to be unrealistic about what Europe can achieve. But I think the more that Europeans are involved, engaged, interested, the more China centres you have at FIA and other things, that's all to the good. We encourage that. We encourage those links. That's the reason that I'm here in Finland and Estonia and Sweden on this trip. The most important players will be other Indo-Pacific countries and the United States.
I have some more questions here, but I think with this running out of time, let's take a few from the audience. And please introduce yourself and keep questions brief. So, Saul, please.
Thanks, Mikael, and thanks, Michael. I'm Saul Paukkunen, and the Managing Director for the time being here at the FIA. And thanks for the excellent presentation. I found that the most intriguing discussions that we have in this building, and we have a lot, are those that we are having with our colleagues and partners coming a bit further away. Always changes our perspective. Just one question. Do you see any risks involved in the way that both Europe and the Indo-Pacific, the Western-minded, are competing to get the attention and divided by these two theaters? Because in Europe we are in a situation where the US presence is now more needed than ever, and at the same time there's a tendency in US policy for the last some years now to shift their gaze towards the Indo-Pacific and China region. Are there risks revolving with these issues?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your comments, and let me just wish you good luck on your forthcoming campaign for President of Finland. I'm happy to endorse you today. Look, it's interesting where you stand depends on where you sit, as the great American political scientist said. Europeans are often, and people in Europe and the Middle East are always, have often said to me since the days of the pivot under Hillary Clinton that, the United States is pivoting away, it's pivoting towards the Indo-Pacific, they're worried about that. From our point of view, the pivot ended up sort of in a repivot, and we see it from the opposite direction, which is that from my point of view, China, notwithstanding how dangerous Russia is, China is the only possible peer competitor to the United States. And if that's the case, then over the long run, the United States does need to reallocate investments towards competing with China. But whenever it feels like it's about to do that, something goes bang in the Middle East or Europe, in this case, a very, very large bang, which causes it to reorient towards the more traditional theatres of Europe and the Middle East. I always think it's like that scene in The Godfather Part 3 where Michael Corleone says, "Every time I think I'm out, they drag me back in." So it's a bit like what I said. It's hard being the United States. It's hard being a global power where countries like Finland and Australia are clamoring for your attention, but then also nervous when we get too much attention, that we're being squeezed out or our sovereignty is being affected or we're becoming poodles or whatever. It must be a bit annoying for the Americans from time to time. Are there risks? Absolutely there are risks. There are risks both ways. There are risks that it misses something by definitely there are risks. I don't know how to mitigate the risks because there's no alternative to the United States. So how can it be in all places at once? Well, it's just got to make judgments. It's got to make decisions about where to invest. I mean, it goes. I suppose one way to answer your question is it goes back to the quality of political leadership in Washington. Will we have presidents and advisors in the next 10 or 20 years who can make rational, logical judgments that are sensitive, that are prudent, that can deal with a crisis here, but not missing out on a more long-term challenge over there. I would say that Biden has been a very good president, actually, much better than most people would say. And I mentioned the quarterbacking of the war in Ukraine. I mean, you can criticize it from lots of perspectives, but if you sort of pull back from an historical point of view, you would have to say it's been very successful. But, you know, 2/3 of Americans think that Donald Trump was robbed at the last election, and there's no Republican candidate that's been able to lay a finger on him. And no actuary could say that there's a 0% chance of Donald Trump being elected president next year, despite the fact that he's been indicted 4 times. So, you know, maybe the biggest risk in this whole risky world is of the quality of political leadership at the centre.
Thank you.
We have a couple of hands. Hiro, I think, was the first one. Yes, please be very brief.
Yes, thank you. I'm Ingrid Svetke from the Finnish Foreign Policy, Nordic Security and NATO Research Programme. Australia's been very active with NATO's partnership policies. So my question to you is that what do you think Australia wants from this developing partnership with NATO, and what kind of role is Australia expecting NATO to have in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region?
Should we take 2 questions?
Yeah, we could take it. I
This
think-
lady here was
I think you
also
were
trying
first.
to get
Yes.
your attention.
Yes, good morning, thank you. I'm the ambassador of Chile to Finland and Estonia.
Hello, Ambassador.
And well, maybe you would also run for office as, you know, we're in
President of Finland.
Yeah. You mentioned that I'm going to take you a little bit to the so-called Global South. And you mentioned that you just question why maybe Australia and other partners have not engaged other countries into, considering supporting President Zelensky's initiatives. And taking you back to the Security Council, when you were in the council in 2013, 2014, we were sharing the council with Australia. Don't you think that the reaction on Crimea was not the best one, and that now we're paying that cost? Could Australia have done something differently as a very important partner in the multilateral arena and in the UN, as you know? And then the second one, also related to the Global South, how are you seeing this expansion of the BRICS and the incorporation of some new actors? How do you see it, from this now, that it's a very recent announcement?
Maria, 20 seconds.
Yes, I have a follow-up. How is Australia prepared for a possible Trump presidency? Do you have like a plan B for if the alliance you're relying so much upon is no longer viable?
Finnish presidency?
NATO, Global South, and Plan Bs.
Great questions, thank you. On NATO, I don't know what the answer to that is. I think it's good that that the Australian Prime Minister has attended the last 2 NATO summits. I think I think that's significant and important. I don't know. I mean, it feels to me like NATO has so much on its plate that its ability to really play a significant role as an alliance in Asia is limited. So I'm more focused, I would have to say, on maybe half a dozen individual NATO members and the sort of role that they can play in the region. I think that's more. I think that's more likely. I don't think you want to. I think the region. I mean, because our adversaries can also use loose language about NATO operating in the Indo-Pacific. They can use that to say that this is the West seeking to bring the NATO system to Asia, which is not true and not possible. But I think we need to be careful of it. I think the most important thing, as I said earlier, is that the regional powers from within the Indo-Pacific, in their own interests, work out that they need to be more active in prosecuting their interests and providing common security. I think that's the most important thing. In terms of the ambassadors' questions, I'm sorry, there was a question about Australia, but what was the first question about?
The first question was, shouldn't Australia have acted
That was the
differently on
second question,
Crimea?
yeah.
That was the first one, and the second one on the enlargement of the BRICS.
Oh yes, the enlargement of the BRICS. Look, I'm not going to allow Beijing and Moscow to psych me out on the BRICS, because I think that is a much looser grouping than the Western Alliance, in my own opinion. I think that we know that India is seeking to balance against China constantly. I mean, we know that there were skirmishes involving Indian and Chinese troops, for goodness sake, a couple of years ago along the actual line of control. The idea that India and China could ever form an alliance or something, a sort of a tight grouping like that, I think is extremely unlikely. Even more so when you think of the other countries that are now meant to be joining it, including, for example, the Emiratis and others that have very deep links to the West. So it's definitely something to watch, but I think there's less to it than meets the eye, in my own opinion. Look, I think all of us should take responsibility for our passivity in that period. I think that like the priest and the Levite in the parable of the Good Samaritan, we saw something happening and we decided to pass by on the other side, and history will note that. I'm not sure what one non-permanent member of the council could have done, but all of us should have been seized with the urgency of what was happening. Of course, it was harder then. Ukraine was not the Ukraine it was last year. It was less united. It had different leadership. But there's no doubt that we encouraged, by our passivity, we encouraged the adventurism, the future adventurism of Putin. And what the last 18 months has shown us is that he is not as strong as we thought he was. He's not as tough as he claims to be. We've seen him draw various red lines. You know, if you provide this weapon system in Ukraine, then we might have to use tactical nuclear weapons, which he never did. Or we might have to escalate in other ways, which he hasn't done. So he was playing mind games with us. That's what I said. That's when I finished my remarks there, that's the one positive, that he was living rent free in our heads for a long time, no longer. On a Trump re-election, and is this the last question? Yeah. So we're finishing on a happy note. Look, I'll give you the good news and the bad news. The good news is that from an Australian perspective, last time Mr. Trump was president, he didn't act against Australia's direct interest in any way. We were on the good side of the Allies. There were various deals that it was thought that he would unpick. He didn't. He focused on other allies, on the Koreans, on Ukraine, of course, on the Japanese, on NATO in general, where he didn't believe in the principle of collective security. So Australia was more or less unaffected in a direct sense. How did we deal with it? We worked on our connections in the Trump White House, but also in what he would call what President Trump would call the deep state, in the civil service, in the military, and it held together. And if he were re-elected again, I think we would return to that playbook. We would. Australia is a very active ally. It's a contributor. We spend a significant amount on GDP, of our GDP on defence. We're seen as a productive ally that stumps. We're sort of better positioned than most allies. that's the good news. The bad news is that that if he is re-elected president, if Americans in their wisdom, having seen what he did last time, then return to him, then I think that would inevitably, necessarily shake all our confidence in the United States. It has to, and it would, because of the critical role the United States plays at the heart of the international system, certainly at the heart of the western part of the system, right in the cockpit of the West. It would shake, it would shake our system to its core, and I'm afraid to say that Mr. Trump was not competent enough last time to put in place all of his instincts, but this time he will have learned from experience. He will have more extreme advisors, more loyal advisors who aren't going to resign and so on. So I think we would have to strap ourselves in. So I think it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous indeed. I think it's very dangerous, and it's hard for someone like me who wrote a book on Franklin Roosevelt and has written about the role of the United States. It's hard to even think about that happening. So I'm not going to think about that happening. I'm going to assume that is not going to happen, or at least I'm going to hope that is not going to happen. I guess I'd finish on this note, and maybe just to go back to the theme of my remarks. If the worst happens, and it does happen, if the worst happens and Mr. Trump is elected president, then I think it behoves the rest of us to further quicken those connections that I spoke about, to further reach out to each other as well as to those elements in the American system that are not Trumpified. We've got to hold the system together. We've got to hold the alliances together until the madness passes, until the fever subsides.
On that ambivalently happy note, we end. Thank you very much, Michael Fullilove.